Good afternoon, everybody. I think we are finally ready to begin. We are happy that we did get our coffee, so if anybody needed a caffeine fix, you now have the opportunity to do so. So welcome to this, the second in our UMAPS Colloquium series for this semester. We always have to begin to say thank you to everybody who makes the UMAPS program possible. That includes the University of Michigan, who provides financial support for the program, comes from the President's office, the Provost's office, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. We also get support often from faculty, including in this current group faculty who has research funding, sometimes make contributions, so thank you to also the faculty. And then also to our donors. And we are very fortunate, for instance, this cohort to have one of our members who was funded graciously by the Gwastala family, who made it possible for us to open up the program to scholars from Kenya. So we cannot do this program without people willing to support it, people who realize the importance of this kind of collegial exchange of ideas. And then also, of course, thank you to all of our UMAP scholars who leave their homes and families and come and spend 5 or 6 months with us here. We as a university benefit greatly from your presence on campus, and we really appreciate that you make that sacrifice of leaving your family and your home and, you know, coming to live a little bit like students on our campus. So thank you very much for that. And also, please, when you make it back home, convey our thank you to your families and to your colleagues who often have to step up and now, you know, take on the teaching that you don't do, and then we benefit really from that extra teaching that they do because it makes it possible for us to spend time with you. So thank you everybody who makes this possible, and welcome to this afternoon's colloquium. A quick announcement about next week's colloquium. So we have another colloquium next week, which was scheduled, and that's what the poster also says, to be held in the Michigan League. We just today learned that this space is available after all, so we'll move next week's colloquium also to here. Please tell everybody you know, but we will also send that information via email to everybody. But please make sure next week's colloquium is also here. So today we have 3 members of our colloquium presenting. Today's presenters are all from the arts, humanities, and humanistic social sciences. Next week we are moving over to the more kind of hardcore social sciences. But today we're very happy to have 3 presenters, and our first presenter for the day is Nosipho Mngomezulu from University of Witwatersrand. Nosipho is working here at University of Michigan with John-Doe, but also with Kelly Askew, because John unfortunately is on leave this semester and therefore not as available as I think we all had hoped he would be. But luckily Kelly Askew was available to kind of be a stand-in. Nosipho, thank you very much. We're happy to have you here, and we look forward to hearing about your research.
Let me begin with Ukbong. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my ancestors, both my biological and intellectual guides. I'm indebted always to my participants in South Africa and in Mauritius, who generously give me access to their stories and help me see in new ways. I'd also like to thank numerous friends and colleagues who have patiently listened to me wrestle with the complexities of what it means to enact an anti-colonial pedagogy and an anti-colonial ethnographic practice, to consider very seriously the stakes in taken for granted concepts, and encourage me to develop appropriate tools to read more carefully. Young people are the numerical majority of the African continent, but they are not only its future, but its present. Yet often they are marginalized in official narratives of the state, often showing up only as imagined future citizens. Bell Hooks shows us how marginality is more than just a site of deprivation, but it is also a site of radical imagination and possibility. It is my hope that we do not take the stories of young people for granted. And so, let's think about some of these stories. Stories are radical. They make us as we make them. As social creatures, we do not make these stories alone, but in a world that is always and already interconnected. One of the many functions of truth commissions is their role in the process of constructing meta-narratives. Truth commissions do more than just deal with the past, but are vital to reconstructing collective memory and instituting new foundational myths. They act as legitimating moments for and shape the character of new regimes. And this becomes quite important as I go on. So please keep that in mind, that we are dealing with stories within stories within stories, as Wladislavik says. And what happens when these stories are sometimes treated as if they have always been that way, when the ideological projects of state-making, of nation-building, start to embed people into neat, fragmented identities, what we might call categorical identification. Although many stories may be conveyed as primordial or territorially fixed, anthropologists are curious about how stories of sameness and usness and difference and themness emerges, how these stories change and why. This is especially important in contexts where there are experiences of colonial violence. So there are high stakes that are often set by dominant parties. Stories of belonging are what Sherry Otner calls serious games. These are the intense play of multiply positioned subjects who are pursuing cultural projects and goals within a matrix of inequality and power differentials. I am curious about why we choose to play the games we play and the consequences of categorical forms of identification. When trying to read or understand my participants' stories, I'm often caught in what Grace Musila would term epistemic disarticulation. This occurs when stories I encounter from young people about blackness, about being in the new South Africa, about being Creole in Mauritius, and their hybridity is not recognized as legitimate and constantly being interpolated into narratives of trauma and slavery. These young people's stories do not match what is often taken for granted in the hegemonic or official narratives. This has invariably led me to confront who gets to tell stories about whom and how. What is at stake in representing incommensurable narratives as shared, like in multicultural nations? What happens when we bring people under the auspices of the Rainbow Nation? But I get ahead of myself here. What happens when these incommensurable narratives, both within and between nations, are treated as static? What happens when the serious game being played is governed by different sets of rules for different actors? Epistemic disarticulation also has everything to do with who is telling the story and how it will be understood. This is a question of power, once again, that asks who gets to name and frame reality. And anthropologists, very famous in our reprehensible canon for naming and confining the other in very particular ways. As a black woman, I was never supposed to be an ethnographer, but the object and the subject, and native informant, as it were. What happens when I have to confront narratives in the field that challenge these reified positions of the objective or the distanced ethnographer? So I think with Grace Musila about epistemic disarticulation, and I'm thinking about how we prioritize and become vigilant about the discursive debris in our research, all the heavy things that my participants have to carry in order to be legible and understandable. In We Need New Names, No Violet Bulawayo says that you end up speaking like you're falling, as if you're an idiot, when the truth is that the language and the whole process that is messed up. And then the problem with those who only speak one form of English or one form of knowledge is this, that they don't know how to listen. They're so busy looking at you falling instead of paying attention to what you're saying that they miss the point. I take this falling seriously, and I say if you can't help but fall, then you need to learn how to make falling an act of disobedience. So can you read? Epistemic disobedience is about paying attention to the politics of knowledge, a form of border thinking, where I can't take for granted, and indeed it becomes imperative for me to pay attention to who we or I imagine is the knowing subject and why. When Morrison asks me, can you read? She's asking me to do the work that Walter Mignolo has been doing in a different context, to say that I cannot study colonialism or the subaltern and maintain the status quo of the social sciences and humanities game, because what I would be doing is simply maintaining the coloniality of power and reproducing epistemic and colonial difference. And so Morrison, when she asked me, can I read, I'm paying attention to more than simply syntax, lexicon, linguistic structures, etc. But really, I'm concerned with how I read, how I learned to interpret and discern what the world means to me, and especially the world that I'm interested in, which is the lives of young black people, both in South Africa and Mauritius. And again, these young people are carrying a lot of epistemic debris in trying to understand, discursive debris in trying to articulate who they are. What I find that young people are often trapped in is this idea that identity is rooted, R-O-O-T-E-D, rooted, like the roots of a tree. However, as social scientists, as scholars of anthropology, we deeply know that identity is not a root, but rather a root. It is a journey that people move through, and so blackness is not necessarily a question of what, but rather a where and when. But this is often missed in how we write about young people's experiences, and especially young black people's experiences, because where have they been? What routes have they moved? But we forget that we do not enter the room only as singular bodies, but we come with us our various histories and also the projected future. And the Truth and Justice Commission is one such space that is trying to imagine a future for young people both in South Africa and in Mauritius, but they're never in the room. So you can imagine that it's very frustrating for me dealing with truth commissions as my ethnographic site and object, because I'm trying to figure out how do I talk about the serious games that young people are playing versus the serious games that these state projects are interested in. It's a trap. So a lot of how we do classic anthropology is overdetermined by concepts and structures that are not developed in the context that we are reading, right? So we're paying attention to European or scholars in the global north and how they conceptualize difference and what it is to be in place. But we are rarely ever learning from the people that we are supposed to be studying about how they understand their social reality. And it makes sense, right? The Truth and Justice Commission, the TRC, are projects that are not just simply located in one territory, but are in conversation with larger geopolitics. You better behave, otherwise you might get freedom bombed into you. So first, it is tragedy. This is the tragedy of apartheid. South Africa's Rainbow Nation moment emerges from the brutality of a long history of settler colonial nation-building projects, and its most triumphant iteration, the system of apartheid. All national narratives are Janus-faced. They are looking back at a golden age and into a projected future. Apartheid, in my work, I describe as an attempt to realize a fiction of boundedness of culture through legislation, whilst rendering material extraction rather porous. So multiculturalism in the apartheid project was read as a problem that needed to be solved, and not just the reality that there are different people of different cultures in this place. It needed to legislate and give categorical identities to certain bodies who could not be porous outside of the extraction of their labor and the extraction of their personhood in order to fulfill the fantasy that was the apartheid project. Q 1991, Desmond Tutu articulates a different kind of national project, a different kind of orientation, trying to recoup multiculturalism as an idea. And Desmond Tutu's words in 1991, he says that, and you remember the rainbow in the Bible is the sign of peace. The rainbow is the sign of prosperity. We want peace, prosperity, and justice, and we can have it when we all, the people of God, the rainbow people of God, work together. And so for the first time in 1991, you start seeing a language of a we being constructed not only around hegemonic whiteness, but rather an interpolation of the other into this new South Africa, right? And the Rainbow Nation discourse in the TRC, although quite frustrating for me to be like, why are you doing this project this way? It was valiant, right? It was an attempt to undo a logic of conquest and extraction and replace it with one of repair. And that becomes tricky because the violence of colonialism is both past and present. When the French decolonial feminist Françoise Vergès, she calls the TRC in South Africa a theater of redemption, where reason will defeat violence. However, this is inconvenient in the post-1994 moment because inequality still runs rampant. And let me move on to Mauritius because I only have 10 minutes. The official narratives of Mauritius go as such. It is the Rainbow Nation because the plurality of practices of ethnic and communal identification within its state borders. In Mauritius, the language of race is rarely employed, but rather the language of community is employed. Mauritius's Rainbow Nation emerges from the vision of Mauritius's first Prime Minister, Sir Ramgoolam. And in 1968, the year that Mauritius gained its independence from British colonialism, he says that our social customs, again invoking an hour for the first time, where the people of Mauritius were not considered all to belong to one nation, but rather were colonized, right? So he says that our social customs and habits have transcended racial and cultural difference. And my job as an ethnographer is to go, how, Sway? How'd that happen? Rainbow Nation here in the official discourse of the TJC marks multiculturalism of the island that is central to defining its characteristic, right? But unfortunately, the inconvenience is that in post-1968 Mauritius, especially amongst Creole and Indo-Mauritians, there's an impasse clumsily patched away by the recognition of both the injustice of slavery and the injustices of indenture. And so what you find happening in the Truth and Justice Commission process is this struggle Olympics, a jostling for, can we make these two experiences that often did overlap but are read as incommensurable in everyday practice? Can we talk about these things in the same breath? And it becomes complicated because in everyday life, even though we might wax lyrical in our academic circles, in everyday life, these intercommunal cleavages are what determine who can live and who can live a good life, right? In the Mauritian official imaginary, the current population of Mauritius comes to be an island through successive waves of migration. And this is a narrative that is put forward in the Truth and Justice Commission's own rationale. So people come to the island through successive waves of migration. It's often even termed an island of migrants. So what happens is that you put slavery as a process of migration. You make indenture a process of migration. You turn settler colonialism as a process of migration. What then happens is that we flatten some of the complexities about how people come to be on this island and how they come to make up these disparate bands of the Rainbow Nation. The Rainbow Nation, as you can tell, is an inadequate metaphor for the post-colonial narratives that I'm trying to understand. But it appears to be the most readily available and accepted in both everyday practice and in our scholarly analysis. Even though more and more people fail to access its promises. The focus on ethnic groups, races, communities in both societies assumes that racial and ethnic communities recognized in the societies consist of relatively stable, distinct, and culturally bounded communities who each will make clear, disparate bands of the rainbow. It is a harmonizing metaphor, and it attempts to transcend inter- and intracommunal cleavages and inequalities, right? People are trying to do a good thing, right? But just because people have good intentions doesn't mean that the consequences of their good intentions will necessarily turn out great for everyone. This Theo Goldberg calls born-again racism, a racism that doesn't want to talk about race. A racism without race is a racism that's gone private, a racism without the categories to name it as such. It is a racism purged of historical roots, of its groundedness, and a racism whose history is lost because we're all now part of the Rainbow Nation. Let's get along to go along to get along. I think that's the story. In South Africa and Mauritius, I hear young people saying, nope. They say no to the thinning of culture. They say no to I'm skipping a part. I hear young people saying no to the thinning of culture into neat strands of the rainbow. In my work, I look at blackness that transgresses the neat bands of the rainbow, and no, which gives me pause to consider my own inherited biases as a woman socialized in the wake of apartheid and is not necessarily free of its grips in my ability to read the social world. When I arrive in Mauritius, I assume that when we say black, we just mean the same thing. We don't. As a scholar, I have been trained in the practices of a very particular Eurocentric episteme and how I produce knowledge. As a black person, I'm just trying to get free while doing my best at my job, just being an ethnographer. And yet often I'm asked and interpolated in being something of a native informant in order to have some access to black interiority, as if I can speak for all black people in all times and all places. So from the young people in South Africa and the young people I meet in Mauritius who say no to hegemonic readings of blackness, even more especially to someone who should know better, I learn to listen and I learn to pay attention. And to see what the no might produce. And what it is producing, I think in the last 3 minutes, I'll try and wrap up here, is to talk about the importance of black opacity. And I'm staying with the trouble here, as Donna Haraway invites us to do. I'm staying with the trouble and saying, what happens if blackness is not rendered legible, consumable, digestible within these neat narratives of rainbowism? As an ethnographer, I've been trained in making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And I've always believed in Mary Douglas when she says that the task of anthropology is to make the world safe for human difference. However, legibility feels like a misdirection, an accumulation of evidence for the racial contract a la Charles Mills. Trying to explain what settler colonialism produced in South Africa and Mauritius, while important, does also feel like a misdirection and a distraction at best, right? And often it's done in quite bad faith, because often one is trapped in discourses of autochthony, of majority versus minority, and proliferation of official discourses playing the serious game of trying to figure out what exactly are you. And I don't think it's important to ask, what exactly are you? I follow the heed of someone who I'm following their heed. I'm following Wright's work, right, in the physics of blackness beyond the middle passage. Sorry, I just like lost my place because I'm trying to skip. And they say that we are black in time. Blackness is temporally and spatially contingent, meaning that one's blackness needs to be contextual. It is subject to both volatile changes depending on time and place in which blackness manifests, right? So both coconuts and Creoles are accused of not doing blackness right. And I'm always fascinated by those who are on the margins of the margins. So if we are looking at the margin of the margins, we get a better sense, because if they are the exception, then what is the rule? There's an implicit assumption in how we register the understanding of a legible and understandable and confinable blackness that betrays some kind of essentialism that we think we have moved past by touting narratives of rainbowism and, I guess, its attendant good feelings. And they're good feelings. I was raised in those good feelings, but it becomes problematic for doing any other kind of politic than a politic of repair, than a politic that is deeply committed to not naming what are the processes of settler colonialism that got us to this point in the first place. So it's hard. And I think as I'm concluding, it's worth reflecting on the significance, on the relationship between a phenomenological project where I'm examining lived experience and its attendant epistemes. So how I'm trying to understand these experiences is just as important than the knowledge I'm going to produce about them. And I've often thought about Archimedes. Had a poster in my classroom as a kid about, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it and I shall move the world. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. What a man committed to knowledge. And I was like, enlightenment, yes. He is not a product of enlightenment, but very important for enlightenment thinkers. But I don't have such a lever, right? I am not Archimedes. I am still me, right? And I can't move the world in its totality. And I can't really make bold claims about blackness across across time and place, but I need to think about how I speak about these vexing experiences of making life livable in the shadow of coloniality. Radical, as homegirl over there, Angela Davis, she says radical simply means grasping something at the roots. And to this I add, grasp it at its roots. But what I can do is pay attention to where and when the construction of blackness happens. So when I look at these roots, I'm less likely to slip into some forms of bad faith that further essentialize, that further box in, that further try to make young black people make sense. I ask, for whom, for why, for what? That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we are also live broadcasting this via Zoom, and we might have people on Zoom. I'm not sure if we have people participating that way this afternoon. Yeah, Taya says yes. So therefore, if you want to ask a question, you need to speak into a microphone so that the Zoom audience can also hear. So we have time for some questions, and please raise your hand. Great.
Thank you so much for that. Is this on, working? Oh, okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk and its poetics, which are just lovely. I wanted to ask you about what happens when you are trying to do something more specific. This is appropriately at a very broad level of generality. So, what comes then in the when the devil's in the details? What happens, and what are some of the projects that you have tried to do that way, if you so far have?
Ooh, that's
And I forgot to say, introduce yourself. This was Judy Irvine from Anthropology. But Judy, you don't have to apologize because I didn't ask to do so. Again, for the sake of our Zoom audience, this question was from Judy Irvine.
Ooh, that's a big question, right? And I mean, it was difficult to figure out how to pitch this for this presentation. I'm not necessarily speaking to other anthropologists or people who are necessarily interested in this. So I was like, let me give you some broad strokes about what's happening in these two locales. But I think for me, the no that I got from my participants about framing themselves in the terms of the Truth and Justice Commission in the Mauritian instance, and also in the afterlife of the TRC in South Africa, was something that I didn't pay attention to in my initial research. I was like, oh, there's something that they're struggling with in finding their authentic blackness. They're struggling to be able to articulate themselves in the appropriate register of being a black South African who's resisting in these particular known forms. Because I wanted to find agents, right? I was thinking that agency is going to operate under very particular terms where these young people were intentional about their hybridity. And so when I went back and looked at these notes, I started recognizing that actually that no was the invitation for me to actually think about what happens when hybridity is not necessarily an intentional project, but it is something that these young people are born into, and it is the world that they're trying to make sense of. They're trying to play these serious games. And so how then my gaze switches to them as the problematic, and I start to go, why is the TJC insisting that young Creoles know themselves as descendants of slaves? Which was definitely something that I worked at the Truth and Justice Commission, and I was like, yeah, you are. And they're like, no, I'm not. I'm not African. I'm not black. I use the political noun black, but I'm not black like you. And I was like, come again? And that was because I was coming with a South African kind of episteme going, this is how settler colonialism plays out. This is how categorical identification plays out. And so for me, it was to go, okay, I'm just going to take you seriously. I'm going to take you at your word, and that you understand your lived experience better than I do. And if I do that, then I recognize how they are then having to look at these other people who are naming them, who are insisting that they're doing something wrong just by existing, right? And why does blackness need to be articulated only in the terms of the dominant, right? So this resistance, pull and pull, push and pull, is interesting if you want to be a politician. You can play that serious game, but not everyone is interested in playing that game. And so for me, it was kind of being attentive to those kinds of moves when these young people are going, no. I really thought they were just being stroppy, but I was like, actually, they're doing something really philosophically dense, and I need to just listen to this word no and what it then produces. I hope that kind of goes to answering that.
Thank you, Nosi. Other questions? And remember to also introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. My name is Nosipho Mngomezulu from UNISA in Johannesburg. I have one question for you, Nosi. When it comes to the capacity development to your students, what are you trying to enforce? And when we're talking about the National Development Plan 2030, what are you trying to, when it comes to that, what are you trying to enforce to your students? And what are your future plans for your projects? Thank you.
Bless. World peace. No, I'm not invested in, what is it, the 2030? I don't even know we had one. That's swell. I'm not invested, and that's not because I don't care, but I realize that doing kind of an abolitionist politic is not going to be consistent with what is being touted as progressive in South Africa. And so for my own sanity, I'm like, bless. Like, that's cute. Enforcing something for my students, I hope I don't enforce anything, but I hope that in the way that I teach, especially foregrounding how anthropology in South Africa came to be what it is and what they understand as our canon, is to pay attention to, like, this is how we come to have the conversations and the debates that we're having. So right now, I'm sure you're following, anthropologists stay in fights. So there's a lot of uproar in the American Academy right now. First in the figure of the Komarovs, now Sherry Ottner is being dragged about using the term dark anthropology. In my own discipline, we're constantly having these debates and wrestling with what it means to use the terms of reference that we use, because we want to be as clear as possible when we're describing people's social lives and social worlds, because these are three-dimensional people. They're not just objects of our ethnography. And so when I teach, I'm trying to encourage my students to really pay attention to people as people and not just subjects or objects of research. And how they then do that kind of work is also going to be informed in a lot of ways with how they are dealing with their own subjectivities and their own positioning. But I am not a pastor. I am not trying to convert anyone into thinking in a particular way, but I am trying to inculcate a sense of curiosity amongst my students so that they feel brave enough to ask the questions about things like no, or why is this normative? Why is this taken for granted? And the students that I'm working with are starting to do work that is really quite creative and pushing boundaries, because they're thinking, if I am on the margin, why am I trying to sound like an old white man? Why am I not sounding like myself? So, you know, Wits University has been really great in trying to encourage a broadening of our linguistic practices, but not just for the affect of Senkhulumi Zulu, right? But to demonstrate the multivocality in our classroom spaces, in how we're thinking about particular things. And so allowing people to think and talk in their own languages, and that unseats your power as a lecturer, because suddenly somebody is speaking Tshivenda, you don't speak Tshivenda. Now you are in a position where you have to ask, do you feel like you can translate that for me? Can we translate that? And I often do an exercise about how you would explain something that you're writing about to your parents at home. And if you can't find a word for it, why is that? It's not necessarily that there isn't a direct translation, but there's kind of a mismatch between what they're learning about at school and what they're expected to perform at home. And that dissonance sometimes feels to them like they are failing when I ask them to maybe think about how the systems that we're in, our educational systems, have been designed, perhaps to make someone like that fail and someone like me succeed. So yeah, no conversion or inculcation.
Thank you very much. And so that we can keep on time, let's thank you, Nosipho.
Good.
Thank you again, Nosipho. So our next presenter for the afternoon is John-Doe Dordzo, who comes to us from University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And John-Doe here at the University of Michigan is working with Kwasi Ampene in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. John, over to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is John-Doe Dordzro. Yes, John-Doe is my name. Yes, and I'm interested in brass band music in Ghana, history, artistry, and social change. I started playing in a church band. I played the trumpet in a church band. And I think I got interested in this area of study when I traveled from my hometown, which is a Volta region, which is about 6 hours drive, to Cape Coast, where I studied and I now work. And when I got to Cape Coast, I actually observed how the brass band tradition is over there, which is totally different from what I've experienced back home. So it's like back home, we try to play hymns like "When Peace Like a River," and then we try to fit this music to already existing genres like Agbaja, when 6/8, when peace peace like a river. Or 2/4. When peace like a river. But when I traveled to Cape Coast, the kind of things these guys were doing with these same brass instruments, the innovation, it was totally different. And it's gingered something in me. Well, I'll have to study them and see how the indigenization and all that came about. So, how do I do this? Okay. The order of my presentation is going to follow this introduction. I'm going to have a brief background statement of the problem, purpose of the study, research questions, methodology, and some findings. I would like to talk about the early history, how these instruments, of course, are foreign to Africa, right? Trumpets, tubas, trombones are not originally African instruments. So where do they come from? In the 14th century, Europe was affected by plague, which in the literature, in the history, killed over 30% to 50% of the population. So there was famine around that area, so they need to trade. In contrast to what was happening around Europe, Africa was booming with trade centers along the Guinea coast. We have the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire around that time, and then the Akan gold forest with lots of gold and all that. So people from Portugal, missionaries and traders, came down to Africa to trade. So when they realized that there was enough gold and all these things coming down from Ghana, I don't know if you can see Ghana here. Yeah, Ghana, around Ghana you see Côte d'Ivoire on the left, Burkina Faso on the north. Yeah, so they traveled all the way down to the coast of Ghana to trade with our people. So let me show you Ghana. Yeah, so this is Cape Coast, and this is Elmina. So the site, the area for this, my interest is Cape Coast and Elmina. So when they came, this area, this coast seemed to be more suitable, since the Akan forest, you see Takwa, you see Prestia, you see Dunkwa. Here, there are mines there, gold, minerals, and all that. So you realize that these areas are not so far from the shore. So they can quickly come and trade and get their stuff, and then they are gone. So this area became a bone of contention. In the history, the British also came along the line. The Danes also came along the line to trade with our people. So with time, they realized that no, the gold, the mineral resources, and the corn, the wheat, everything was just so wonderful around this area. So they called for more reinforcement, as I may see it. I may say they brought more ships came along with all that. And when everything was going so well, in 1471, they asked the king of Elmina, around that time he's called Kwamina Ansa, to give them a piece of land so that they could build a warehouse. All right? So in 1481, the Elmina Castle was built as a warehouse to keep the gold, the corn, the wheat, and all that around this area. Okay, so it came to a point that this castle from the 1800s to 1935 was turned into a slave post where the indigenous African citizens were captured and put here to await the ships that come to pick them away into them. So I just want to talk about this to explain how these instruments came to land on African soil or in Ghana. So in 1475, soldiers from the West Indies arrived on the shores of Ghana. And of course, before they can take control of the land, they have to fight the Portuguese, right? So they fought and sacked them, and then they took control. When they were coming, they brought with them bands, all right, like trumpet, like the other instruments. During their free time, they play music like the polkas, the waltz, from inside the castle. So the indigenous people got interested in these instruments, and then they learned how to play these instruments under the military men. All right. So now, that is how the brass instruments landed on the shores of Ghana. I would like to play the kind of marches that they were playing then, and then also play what was actually indigenized. So let me see if I can do that. Boss, yeah, it's up to you now to play that music for me. Yeah, thank you. All right, it's okay. Yeah, we know that already. So now let's turn to the indigenization process. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, statement of the problem, right? Considering the rich variety of musical traditions within different ethnic groups in Ghana, the fact remains that a lot more work needs to be done in terms of documentation. Unfortunately, little research has been done with regards to brass band music in Ghana. So the scant literature available can be categorized into 4. The first one has to do with the scattered non-specialist accounts in the pre-colonial and colonial periods. The second one has to do with people who actually wrote about high life music, but not brass bands. But since the brass bands were the precursor to the high life, they wrote a little about brass band music. And then the third one people like Abuaji, Ebonyi, and Hupoti who wrote on military music, and they also wrote on brass band music a little. And then the fourth group are people who wrote their masters and dissertations on brass band music, like Dordzro, Emisa, and Kuno. So there is lack of literature or research on brass band music in Ghana. So the purpose of my study, to offer a detailed historical and ethnographic account exploring the diverse ways military and missionary activities have shaped brass band music in Ghana. Okay, all right. So I'll just move on. So the next, what I would like to, okay, yeah, thank you. And I also intend to document the local Adaha, Achum, and Kokuma songs. All right. So research questions. What were the circumstances that led to the establishment of brass bands in Ghana? What agents are responsible for the band's proliferation across Ghana? What was the reception of European bands, and how did indigenous musical traditions influence this accepted tradition? What is possible? Was it possible that the brass bands were an indication of anything more than they assimilated and reviled forms? Or does this imply a simple acceptance of military and missionary psychological norm by Africans? So, the theoretical foundation, at this point, I mentioned key concepts that shaped my thought, and most importantly, ones that demonstrate the extent to which these concepts of cultural contact emanate from epistemological foundations. The study of expressive cultures that emerged from cross-cultural encounters necessitates the navigation of textual minefield replete with special terminology such as appropriation, assimilation, reinterpretation, and diffusion. These concepts define the process of contact and interaction between various cultures by which one adopts elements of the other. In the context of music, the process of contact and change may affect the organization styles and instruments as various levels of musical interaction. So I quickly talk about my methodology. This is mainly qualitative, and the area for this research is Elmina and Cape Coast. Purposive sampling was used to choose bands that are available in Elmina and Cape Coast. Observation, semi-structured interviews, content analysis of archival records, newspapers, memoirs, diaries, and all that was done. All right, let me talk about brief findings that I've here. So the brass band, am I there? Yeah. Findings. The brass band is something of a social phenomenon, a brotherhood, part of Ghanaian way of life. Truly, amateur bands are not merely haphazard groupings of players who happen to enjoy a blow. They have a more serious purpose, part of which is to give opportunity for the unfolding of artistic skill and experience of those whose daily tasks are all too often monotonous and unsatisfying, although necessary. It has also been said that the English-trained local military musicians, these local musicians gradually learned to play in the Cape Coast band under European conductors. And also, I would like to talk about Ottawa Band. Ottawa Band was considered the first band, local band made up of indigenous players. The first band made up of indigenous players. But it was never mentioned in the available literature. The Achum bands, also they are considered the initial stages, the fife and drum bands that preceded the brass bands. The brass bands as a vehicle for projection of identities. Yeah, so this is a picture from 1871 from a town called Agona, where we have the Achum bands in the archive. So progress on the book project is actually a book project. Project The progress I've made so far, a huge amount of data has been collected and analysis is also underway. I've worked on a tentative structure of the book. The first draft of the chapter 1 is completed. I'm very happy to say that. Additional work to be done, transcription of and scoring of music will be done. Hopefully, I intend to visit the British Museum for additional data, visit the colonial archives in Bremen, visit to the Dutch National Archives. A summary and conclusion. So this research contributes an empirical informed understanding of the colonial experience and musical expression in West Africa through an ethnographic study of amateur brass bands in the Republic of Ghana. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the Western hegemonic cultural tradition of the brass band was exported across the globe through imperialist institutions such as the military and the church. By 1873, gradual innovations in Ghanaian local brass band music had begun that dramatically changed the nature of Western military and other concerts and ballroom styles. It is surprising that music became deeply involved in the battle of cultures that characterized the colonial encounter, with the colonists seeking to conquer indigenous knowledge in order to disarm a people who had deployed their cultures not only to resist evangelization, but also to fight the imposed alien order. While European colonialism was intrinsically driven by economics, it was also culturally propagated, legitimated, and popularly contested, employing bands. The function and symbolism attached to bands and brass instruments were central in the construction of an image of the colonial empire. Bands helped to authenticate ideas of authority, particularly European notions of order and discipline through military power. The arrival of the European military instruments, fife and drums and bugles, underscores the beginning and the transformational stage of the brass band music world in Ghana. Later, the local people indigenized their own local styles, such as Achum, Adaha, high life brass bands, and subsequently Kokumba and Bobobo. Ghana eventually attained independence on 6th March 1957 under the able leadership of Osagifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Throughout the long struggle of colonial rule, brass, high life, Kokumba, and Bobobo music were key to how the people of Gold Coast conceptualized their changing world. So in this case, I can say that the master's tool was used to destroy the master's house. The aesthetic principles and historical patterns that was identified here are to a large extent unique to the current context. However, these trajectories should not be understood as applicable to the Fanti people of Cape Coast and Elmina alone. Some of what I described here is similar or applies as well to other countries in Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Indonesia, and the African sub-region. But because my research experience is with the people of Cape Coast and Elmina, I can only apply my argument with confidence to these spheres, to some extent to the Ghanaian situation. Expanding it to include broader world sensibilities is beyond the scope of my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have time for questions.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
First behind you, Naomi, and then you, Naomi. And question askers, remember to introduce yourself. And Taya, if there's anybody on Zoom asking a question there, then you have to voice for them. But first, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that beautiful talk. It took me back to my childhood days, back in the north of England, and it reminded me there's something very universal about what you were speaking about, and that is the social fabric of where I grew up among the among the factories of Northern England. To belong to a brass band is a great badge of honor, and one of their functions was to express their solidarity as workers during very tough times, like in the mid-19th century, the times that Marx and Engels were writing about, the satanic mills. Those brass bands played a huge role in keeping people together and expressing their solidarity with each other. So thank you for reminding me about that.
Thank you very much.
So I don't know if you want to comment on that, John. It wasn't a question as much as a reminiscence, but do you want to maybe say something about the connection between brass bands in Northern England versus Ghana?
Yeah, what I would like to say about that is very unfortunate with the wonderful or the good reasons that it was organized in England and all that. When it it was brought to Africa, it was different because it's unfortunate that music that is supposed to really comfort, like, entertain, became a symbol of oppression and suppression and all that. But I'm really happy about how the indigenous people capitalized actually on it, because they were actually stopped from playing their local drums and all that, since it was said that they were hitting culture. And it's not, they cannot play. So they quickly adopted these instruments, the trumpets and all that, and actually didn't just continue playing the music of the colonial master, but actually indigenized their own style of playing these instruments, to suit their own, beliefs and to satisfy themselves. So I think, yeah. That's all I have to say about that.
Want to respond?
Yeah, thank you. There is a universality about that, and it's beyond the universality is the expression of local indigenous rhythms and music, and but the overall social aspects of a brass band are, I believe, are universal.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Naomi, over to you.
Hi there. Oh,
Thank you.
there we go. It's just a little easier. Naomi Andre, connected with the African Studies Center and DAS, Department of African American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Residential College. Yeah, it takes me forever just to say all that. However, at heart, I'm a musicologist. And so I found your project really wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about it as we can be in closer connection. There are just three really quick things to mention that we can follow up on. And just very briefly, here at Michigan, you're in a wonderful place for brass bands, the marching band tradition. And
band,
even if it's just sort of a little footnote or something, maybe it's part of the collegiality that brass bands just naturally put together. It was really interesting to see, I think it was just 2 minutes of that excerpt, but how it started out with the brass, with all the instruments. Then the trombones and the trumpets dropped out, and you had there was a snare, there was a bass drum, and then there was sort of a rhythm. Yes. So it was, and then some of the brass band players were speaking, and then they came back. So it seems like there's this really interesting indigenization issue going on what the norms are, who knows when to play, sort of how to play, whether it's speaking or, so that is just really fascinating. So just brass bands and following up with sort of collegiality, and here at Michigan, we've got to find some way for you to work just as a footnote or something there.
All right.
Another thing is, I know in terms of musicologists, there's somebody here, Kate Brucher, who finished, and she's now teaching in Chicago, not far by. I don't know what her projects are, but she was looking at brass bands as they went to Portugal. And I think it was Portuguese European folks, but also bringing in jazz. And she was sort of talking as a participant, observer, ethnographer. Did you ever meet Kate? Because I think she did. Maybe it was through Kelly or some. But she, that might be an interesting project. Just again, very different from what you're doing. But I think it was, and I didn't know so much about it. But the brass band tradition doing something else. And then the last point I'll make, just really quickly, and this is an article I can give you a citation for, Arne Spoor, who is at the nearby Bowling Green University, so in Ohio. He's a medieval Renaissance scholar, but he was looking at, and he's from Bonn, Germany, actually the same town as Beethoven, and he was looking at African musicians, and I want to say, and he was following certain records who were brought to play in the courts in Germany in the, I think this, so that would be the 15th century, the 1400s. So as you were sort of talking about this European, African continent connection and musicians, I thought, oh, wow, this is what an interesting thing going the other way. So I find your project so fascinating. I don't really have a particular question, except I'm so glad you're doing this.
Thank you very much, Naomi.
And it sounds as if there are some connections we have to make sure. I mean, John-Doe still has like 2.5 months. We'll make sure you get these connections to Bowling Green and Chicago, both of which are close enough that you might actually talk to people there.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Well, Nosipho.
Yeah.
So just wait for the microphone. There you go.
It was on one of your. It was on one of your slides.
Oh, okay.
There was something about like, I can't remember it now, but I think about like the ways in which this knowledge was carried through. So it's not necessarily written down. So who is telling these stories? How are these stories carried? Could you maybe tell me like the context where we learn about these stories? Is it in a tavern, a pub, a school, a church? Where is this history and knowledge of brass band, especially the indigenization? I think it was that initial band that wasn't written into history, but everyone seems to know it. So how do people know about it, and how are the indigenous processes of keeping that history? How do you see that play out? Because I think that's really fascinating, because clearly people know about them. So how do they come to know about them?
Yeah, actually, I think I've spoken about people who wrote on the history of colonialism, around that time, and they made mention of the bands. And I've also mentioned people who wrote on high life music. And then since the brass band was the precursor to the high life style of music, they also did some background checks, but they did not actually go in depth as I am doing now, because their focus was on high life, not brass bands. So they mentioned about the castles and how these instruments were imported into the country, and how the indigenous people learned how to play these instruments, and then it was brass bands, and later it was transformed into high life music and all that. So mainly the source of my data is actually from the archives. I went into the archives to dig for any traces of these bands in the archives, and also interviews. I actually have this very old man who I think is the last man standing from the Otaba band that I've just mentioned. And I think I'm very lucky to to meet him, who actually told me lots of stories about the bands and what it means to them and all that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And then our last presenter for today is Phuti Sepuru, who comes to us from University of Pretoria in South Africa, And we're going from brass bands in Ghana to jazz pianists in South Africa. And Phuti here at University of Michigan works with Marian Hayden from School of Music, Theatre and Dance, but I think also kind of with Naomi and maybe also with Kwasi, because I know she has an office space in DAS and there's a lot of musicologists in DAS. Phuti.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will be talking about exploring elements of musical style in South African jazz pianists, which is the larger work that is informing my current research as part of the UMAPS program. Robbie Jansen in Dev Roop and Walton says the following: jazz, as far as I'm concerned, would be an extension or expression of the self. You get all the information, you learn how to paint a picture, and then you paint a picture of your environment. So to tell your story, you learn your craft and then tell the story in your own words. The video we just watched was pianist Sbusiso Mashilwane painting his story in a composition titled 1976. This work reflects on the 1976 Soweto uprisings, providing a reminder about the experiences of Black South Africans, the violence that surrounded them, and the tragic fatalities of young leaders. One of the musical features incorporated include foot stomping as a visual and sonic representation of shaking the chains of injustice, while simultaneously anticipating the victory of human rights. As a jazz pianist, over the years, I've become particularly interested in unpacking the idiosyncratic attributes embodied in the South African jazz accent. Furthermore, as a student that studied at a South African university that did not focus on South African music, I have sought to explore more elements related to this in my postgraduate research. The purpose of this research was to explore the processes, narratives, and beliefs that have shaped the musical styles of 10 South African jazz pianists in order to understand their unique approach to the jazz style. This was done by exploring their backgrounds, performance practices, and philosophies, and exploring their works and the works of other pianists that they considered to be exemplars of the style. The main, or the fundamental question rather, that guided the research was, what are the processes, narratives, and beliefs that have shaped the thinking surrounding the musical styles and creative processes of selected South African jazz pianists? For the purpose of the study, semi-structured interviews were used, and a multiple case studies research design was utilized. 10 South African jazz pianists were interviewed, namely Susan Barry, Themba Mkhize, Nduduzo Makhathini, Sbusiso Mashilwane, Andile Yenana, Melvin Peters, Neil Gonsalves, Carl Shepard, Bokani Daya, and the now late Andre Peterson. The questions guiding the research probed their backgrounds and formative influences, their understanding of style, their views on their own style, and their incorporation, if at all, of South African elements in their works or the works of other pianists. The model that guided the analysis of the data was Creswell's 2018 cyclical data analysis spiral, and I'll just speak to the different stages involved in these and then show you visual representations of how this was done. So the first stage was data management, which spoke to the transcribing of the data, how to store data, managing and securing it, and tabulating it. The second stage, reading and memoing, spoke to identifying short, pronounced phrases that would assist in coding or the identification of themes, which were then noted on the side of the table. The third, describing and classifying, involved scanning the coded interviews and assessing the frequency of information and prevalent ideas, representing a shift from what Gibbs 2007 referred to as descriptive to analytical coding. Codes were then placed in a single table and similar material highlighted in one color. The fourth stage, developing and assessing, in this stage, patterns within the color codes were identified and grouped together. An exploration of these led to the identification of themes. These were repeatedly scrutinized and triangulated, analyzed repeatedly, reviewed repeatedly, and then grouped into overarching themes. The final stage was representing and visualizing, which was a visual representation of the inductive data analysis in the results through linking the raw data to the findings. What I'm going to show you is the pretty part of it all, not the scribbling that was involved. So this is an example of Andile Nana's interview, just the beginning. So what you see in the left-hand column is the initial descriptive coding, so reading line by line, seeing what is coming out. The next part, once all the interviews were transcribed and coded, this is just the first page, involved putting them all across, putting similar ideas in the same color or the same font color, and then eventually, after working through all of this and trying to sort of untease what was being said, overarching themes are identified, and then different colors based on the different themes were placed under the different main themes and sub-themes, just so that I'd know who said what and go back to all these tables. And this really speaks to the first part of the data analysis spiral. Once all of this was done, the main themes, a table was created, which I call the final table, with the main themes, sub-themes, the underlying themes, and the raw data that could be associated with each of these themes. And this was the final table. Today I'll be speaking to the three themes that emerged in the study, and that is developing a musical style, negotiating a personal style, and then finding the South Africanness in jazz. Developing a musical identity. The research found that the foremost of the influences on the development of musical identities by the interviewed pianists was based on personal and social encounters. Parents, siblings, and friends had a significant impact on the participants' early conceptions of musical style and musical preferences. Parents who had careers in music or partook in music lessons guided them along a similar path, while those who had no musical history served as a source of motivation and support. Modeling older siblings, as well as imitating and learning from friends, were also viewed as key factors in some of the participants' initial fascination with music. The impact of place was immense. Musical elements absorbed from the participants' surroundings had an impact on their development of musical identities and their current personal styles. The township was named as a breeding ground due to the varying musics that they were naturally exposed to. Upon reflection, it was found that these musics became a critical component of the participants' musical identities. Traditional music heard in the townships was found to be influential, as was music encountered at ceremonies and jazz recordings that their neighbors would play. The church was a formative place where selected participants were exposed to hymns and musical elements that they would later connect to the jazz style and their personal voice. The church also provided participants with an opportunity to develop their growing musical abilities. South Africa's despotic political history influenced the participants directly. Racial boundaries set by the apartheid regime led to one participant developing elements in his music that did not entirely speak to his social background. For some, this meant that they had to navigate ways in which to exist as jazz musicians in such an environment. Despite the suppression and stringent laws, ethnic practices continued to thrive. The interviewed pianists have been able to develop their musical styles through a combination of formal, informal, and I say informal, in that way, and autonomous learning. Learning through self-discovery was critical to the development of the participants, particularly prior to engaging in formal lessons. For one participant, engaging in this form of learning subsequent to an extensive career allowed him to grow previously neglected areas in his playing. Learning informally from others, particularly from established jazz musicians, was found to be important in launching the participants' identities in music, in turn developing their music and identities as described by Hargreaves et al. Formal learning was important across the board. All the participants pursued jazz studies at tertiary level. The second eldest participant actually was about to start his formal degree at the age of 60, just after the interview. Participants, however, felt that there was a lack of focus on South African jazz pianism and musical styles in South African university curriculums. Direct encounters with jazz musicians, either through attending live shows or direct conversations, were integral to the learning and growth of some of the participants. Collective making music too had a significant and educational influence on them. The interviewed pianists were able to develop their personal styles and familiarity with music from other ethnic groups through playing professional gigs. This method of learning was referred to by some participants as the most significant. Listening was vital in shaping the musical identities of the pianists. Their earliest conceptions of style were subconsciously influenced by the music that they heard in their natural environment. Once they began pursuing careers in music, they developed mental musical needs and musical preferences guided their listening. Their musical preferences were also directed towards the works of pianists or other instrumentalists who shared similar backgrounds to theirs, or music that contained traits they wanted to emulate in their own playing, thus informing their developing musical identities. The research found that the development of a musical style follows a similar trajectory to identity, and this involves a constant negotiation between the self, intra, and others, inter, which Ibema et al. Refer to as the dual culture of identity. The generated responses indicated that while formative influences were integral to the participants' developing musical identities, they had to discover and assert their sense of self within these multiple environmental influences. The second theme, negotiating a personal style. Describing style was a challenge for the pianists, but their descriptions became more nuanced as the interviews progressed. The study identified two methods of portraying musical style, the first of which being the outward. This refers to noticeable or apparent elements within the music that have been shaped and named over time. These include musical characteristics, including having a style within a style, historical perspectives, and interpretation. The other, an inward approach, refers to the innermost personal or hidden elements within an individual based on their experiences, which then shape the approach that they take in their music. This was found to be reliant on socially and culturally negotiated style based on the pianist's distinctive personal and musical journeys. Thus, their musical identities being informed by listening and consolidation of their musical encounters and a need to reflect the South African approach to jazz. The final theme was finding the South Africanness in jazz. It was somewhat surprising to discover that a significant number of the participants were not satisfied with them being referred to as jazz musicians, as they perceived the description as limiting. Several participants felt that the jazz musician label failed to recognize the idiosyncratic characteristics present in the musical styles of South African pianists. This concurs with similar assertions by Magopa et al. Some pianists expressed a distaste for the term as it suggests an American influence while disregarding African contributions to the formation of the style, supporting an article by Vincent and Lindsay from 2007. Andre Peterson spoke to how two musicians, Errol Dyers and the late Robbie Jansen, referred to their music as Cape folk music and Cape-influenced improvised music, respectively. He argued that some of Abdullah Ibrahim and Moses Maleleka's works could not be considered as jazz, rather referring to the latter as a world music specialist and sound scientist. Themba Mkhize, too, referred to himself as a street musician and said that he does not consider himself a jazz musician as the term did not reflect the varying elements that constituted his musical style. Nduduzo Makhathini voiced that he was often referred to as a jazz pianist but found the term jazz problematic in itself. He found resonance in referring to his music as improvised music, as that created a platform for people to locate it. These suggestions not only display a common need to diverge from a stereotypical association, but also to fully assert the contextual influences in the South African jazz approach. Two pianists expressed a partiality for the term. One said that this was due to the respect associated with it, while the other viewed owning an identity as a jazz musician as a point of departure for his musical expression and identity. The participants also spoke to a need to explore South African jazz pianism in the way that Maskandi guitarists have altered the guitar to work for their style. Their musical styles were often used as a means to assert their identity and pride in an environment that made them feel like the other, even through media. The lack of recordings and documentation of this music was also noted. Consequently, they viewed themselves as representatives of a South African jazz piano style and expressed that their compositions served to articulate the South Africanness. The research also found that home language contains implicit culturally unique prosodic articulations, which are subtly voiced musically in the styles of South African jazz pianists. The nuanced timbre, meter, and texture of an indigenous language, such as the Zulu dialect, impacted musical expression in subtle ways. Incorporating elements from traditional music was viewed as a way of sustaining indigenous practices. Essentially, the participants were speaking to their own accent within the jazz language. There is an existent need to articulate indigenous musical influences from other ethnic cultures aside from one's own. The indigenous musics from hegemonic ethnic cultures in their locales were absorbed into the pianist's personal styles. These participants, often viewed as the other due to their ethnic differentiation, can be seen as incorporating these elements in response to interlocking systems of oppression and their social encounters. The participants who did not stem from these cultures noted that their styles reflected their genuine lived experiences and encounters with this music. The musical styles of South African jazz pianists is impacted by elements of other styles and genres, predominantly Afro-American jazz and Impressionist music for those interviewed. This influence does not diminish their unique nuances. These are transformed through the incorporation of indigenous elements into musical elements such as melody, which is considered to be the most important, harmony, and rhythm. The participants subconsciously absorbed musical influences from the indigenous music that they heard in their environments while growing up and found ways to incorporate them into their compositions. Simple singable melodies, the obscure dissonances found in Amahubo, which is Zulu indigenous classical music, the irregular rhythms found in Xhosa and Zulu music, Ndebele Sangoma initiation music, these were some of the described contributing influences. Harmonies from church hymns or combining jazz harmony with traditional harmonies was common, or traditional melodies rather was common. Themba Mkhize, for example, created his own modal system based on the music of Princess Magogo, which he named Nongoma, which is not only an area in KwaZulu-Natal, but also speaks to, it has multiple meanings within that context. So song, music, but also naming ways in a way that reflected his identity. The musical styles of South African jazz pianists constitute audible and imperceptible elements, such as simple melodies stemming from traditional repertory and rhythms that organically contain cross rhythms emanating from indigenous music. These rhythms at times come from traditional dances such as Indlamu, which Busiso Mashilwane named as a key influence in his approach to swing and his emphasis on the downbeat. Indigenous dances are often used as inspirations for rhythmic grooves and at times juxtaposed with American elements. The participants named Abdullah Ibrahim, Andile Yenana, and the late Begum Selegu and Moses Taba Mulelekwa as pianists who reflected a South African approach to their ability to, because of their ability to amalgamate internal I and external me elements in their music, speaking to their individual histories. The backgrounds of South African jazz pianists provide them with a unique context to extract influences, thus informing their distinct approaches and compositions. So while external influences are inexorably perceivable in their music, the varying ethnic musics, and thus multiple identities distinct to the South African milieu, present an inherent eccentric articulation of musical elements, reflecting a clear-cut nationalism. Furthermore, to fully comprehend the interpretation of style in the works of South African jazz pianists, one is to be aware of the supporting historical narratives. Pianist Ntuduzo Makhathini, for example, is also a sangoma or healer, and he elaborated on the role of ancestry and dreams in his music and how this provided the underlying narrative behind his award-winning album, Ikambi. The song Amatambo, meaning bones, speaks to the coming together of bones during divination and improvisation, and bringing these two modes together to form musical gestures that could be interpreted for healing. There is another song, Umlahlankosi, which is the branch of a tree that is regarded to be sacred within the Zulu tribe. If someone dies in an unnatural way, for example, in a car accident, it is believed that through the branch of Umlahlankosi, you are able to go and recollect the spirit and direct it home. So though the music carries attributes and characteristics that are found within jazz music, the narratives are purely South African. Therefore, beyond the music, knowing the pianist's background, encounters and unique anecdotes, the deeper meanings behind titles, and understanding holism within the African context, so speaking to healing, music, and dancing as a single entity is significant. In conclusion, the findings of this research suggest that a South African jazz musical style is the result of a complex dynamic of interactive factors that develop alongside participants' personal and musical identities in an ongoing symbiosis of internal and external factors and over time. The current research found that in the development of the unique style of South African jazz pianists, there's a middle ground that is found between the self and societal influences. Furthermore, musical style is always provisional, as social and individual identities are continuously contested and reconstituted through time. This negotiation between internal strivings and external prescriptions reflects a discursive positioning, particularly in the presence of factors such as language, culture, and the presence of the sense of the past and how individuals are responding to that past. The findings suggest that the continuous negotiation between the inner and outer unfolds over time, creating patterns of thought that become subconscious. Furthermore, labeling by others is beneficial in the identification of a personal style. This reflects how their musical styles are socially negotiated. Thus, personal agency is constantly at play in the process of finding the voice of South African jazz pianists. The musical styles of South African jazz pianists reflect the impact of the developing self. The self in South Africa involves ancestors, family, others, and how one defines themselves in light of who one is individually, intellectually, politically, and musically. Musical style, like personal style, is therefore largely the realization of subconscious and conscious impulses to events internal and external, constantly evolving in real time. The South African jazz musical style, therefore, embodies the unique phenomenological socio-political experience and societal factors interpreted through performer and listener. My current, I'm sorry to interrupt the music, projects include working on an article that speaks to articulating the South Africanness in jazz pianism. And the second, which is almost done, is in conversation with Susan Barry, who was the only female participant in my study and one who I found the most resonance with, which is interesting as I am a black woman born at the time when a democratic South Africa was being negotiated, and she is a white woman who lived through apartheid and musicked during that time with black musicians. She was the pianist for Busi Mhlongo. And I'm also working on a book project. I can't talk about the one yet, because the devil is a liar. But the other one speaks to turning my doctoral dissertation into a book. And I think it's important that I thank a number of people. First, I'd like to thank the African Studies Center and the UMAPS program for really allowing us this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And then I'd like to thank my mentors. I am mentored by many people here. Ms. Marianne Hayden from the School of Music, Professor Naomi Andre, who has listened to me, and Professor Carol Miller from UPenn. I'd also like to thank the University of Pretoria, School of the Arts, for allowing me time off. And I'd like to thank my parents, who I hope are watching if they got the Zoom thing right. And then I'd also like to thank Lindo Mbele, who provided a lot of the images that you've seen on the screen. And I'd also like to thank my UMAPS cohort, especially those who listen to me endlessly. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for questions.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
Other people haven't. Okay, fine. Hi. Thank you so much. There are so many things. I feel like you, John, and I have so many conversations that we need to have. I'm particularly interested in how you're thinking about Duduzi's very overt project of rendering his work a spiritual practice, especially as a healer. And, you know, I follow him quite a lot. I go to his shows, and I find that there's often this thing of not doing the translating of what he's doing, right? Because it is a practice that has historically been tried to be explained away as ubungoma is somewhat like Catholicism adjacent, whatever. And so when I see him perform and I hear him performing, there's something really grounding for me in how he is articulating an indigenous practice that isn't trying to make itself legible, but is inviting, for me at least, other people to walk with him, even if you don't necessarily understand what it's like to be Sangoma. But the way in which he heals through his music, for lack of a better word, he is doing a healing practice, and he will participate in customs that are usually associated with Umgoma. And so I'm just curious how you work with that, because I think it's like just a unique way of doing his art, and I think very consistent with many ways in which African creators have used art, not necessarily separate from spirituality, not necessarily separate from like everyday work, but how these things might speak to one another. Just particularly for his case, if you might want to tell me, let me in on some secrets.
So, speaking honestly, Dordzro's story was probably one of the most challenging for me. And simply because I think the analysis process involved a lot of unlearning. And I think the ways in which we've been taught don't teach you how to deal with such data or such information. And so a big part of me was having conversations, because there were times when I'd speak to people and say, this is the only participant that is saying this. You know, his compositions come to him through his dreams. He uses playing the piano, you know, in the same way that a healer would be throwing the bones, you know, and he uses it as a form of healing, to the point where he talked about one of his shows where, you know, people were not okay, and he just said, here's water. I'm basically going to be using that as a medium with the music that I'm using to you know, change what is happening in the room. And music for him does that. And the challenge was that I had conversations with some researchers, and some said, but dreams are nothing new. I mean, dreams have been existing. So, you know, and then you find people who say, oh, it's just a story, it's a gimmick, you know, yeah. And then there was one day, I received funding from the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and during one of the research meetings, I had a chance to speak to Professor Grace Kuno from the University of Johannesburg. She's in sociology, but she's also a healer. And I said to her, I've been having conversations about this particular participant, and I'm really not sure how to read this. And she said to me, this person is telling you what is happening, you know, and we are so used to looking at things from the Western, where things don't make sense, and then we try to read things based on our limited knowledge. And that's why I say the analysis took months. It was probably the most complex process, because I had to sit with myself and, you know, use my baggage as wisdom, or my knowledge rather as wisdom, whereas it was serving as baggage. And it involved me actually understanding what is happening in his music, talking to him about what is going on, because I can listen to Ikambi, for example, and say, I can hear this is South African. I can hear that there are jazz elements therein. But if I don't understand what the music is talking about, then I'm going to interpret it, or misinterpret it rather completely. And so for me, asking someone to engage with me and talk to me about their work, asking them to explain methods of, you know, or issues related to ancestry or healing or divination that I'm not familiar with, was a way for me to understand. Because reading the information that he shared otherwise would have been a disservice. So for me, I'm not saying, hey, I know it, but this forced me to unlock other areas of knowing that I haven't been taught about. So it's definitely an ongoing thing, and anyone that has listened to Dordzo knows that it is a spiritual experience. You're not going to walk in and leave the same way. And it also goes to the people that have influenced him. Your Coltrane's, Alice and John, your McCoy Tyners, you know, who found his inspiration from African music. Begum Selegu, who he writes on often, who had the same element of spirituality within his music. So I don't have an answer to your question. but I've done so much learning and unlearning and understanding those different things. And even just his own understanding of sangoma, the song within that description as well. You know, it really speaks to what he is trying to do.
While we wait for somebody else, let me, just abuse my position as the moderator and ask a question. So you yourself are also a jazz pianist, or a pianist, maybe jazz is not the right term. Can you separate yourself from being the researcher that analytically looks at the music when you turn to be a musician yourself? So what's the relationship between the scientist Phuti and the musician Phuti?
It's a difficult relationship, but it also serves as an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. I actually wrote a book to actually reflecting on that process. So I think one of the challenges we have in musicology, especially related to South African jazz, is that a lot of people that write about the music are not necessarily practitioners. So it was good as a practitioner to talk to other practitioners. And the challenge sometimes with being the researcher and also being, I don't want to say participant observer, but a form of participant observer, is that you can think that you know. And I remember submitting a 40,000 word analysis chapter, interesting. And my supervisor said, oh, this is great, this is the first stage. Yeah, this is just the beginning. And that's because I was reading the data. Like, I was telling the data what to say. And I think that is sometimes the disadvantage. So I really had to sit back and do a lot of scribbling. So for me, it serves as an advantage and as a disadvantage. And I'm learning when to sort of understand my positionality and also reflect a lot within research. And I think it's beautiful that I get to unpack the things I'm interested in as a practitioner, but I'm still navigating that. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. But I think it also allows me access to more musicians because it helps when practitioners are writing about the music as well.
Naomi. And I think, John, were you raising your hand? Naomi and then John.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Just, there's so much rich information there. And so one point, and I'm glad that we're in continuing conversations, it was really lovely to see you present this. And it sounds like all of those, the analytical charts you made with the colors and it's pretty intense. So yeah, hats off for how to handle such complicated ethnographic data. I guess the question or the point I want to make, and it's sort of based on being here today and opening up with this idea of what are stories and who's telling the stories, maybe the big question isn't what is South African jazz, but maybe it is here are South African jazz styles or jazzes, I don't know what the plural is, instead of trying to synthesize. And it's a very musicological thing to say, all right, here are my examples and what are the common elements and what are the, what's the outlier, what's the obvious thing, and I guess, that's fine, but maybe it isn't trying to synthesize it into one story. But to have multiple stories, because it sounds like no matter how detailed an analysis you can do, it's never going to be everything. You've got primarily men. You've got people, they're different generations. And I think it is a gift for you to be somebody who knows this, not just somebody like me who likes to know this. But I don't play jazz piano. But you get to we get to read your understanding of it, which is basically what we want as readers. I think most of us are gone from, the objective scientific truth of jazz pianism. Maybe there is something when it talks about what a molecule is, but it's different when we're talking about an art. And so this is all just to say, I think the heterogeneity, the polyphony and contrapuntal nature of what you're doing is actually, that is the strength. It's not to try to say, here's the one story that, you know, a la, you know, Western musicology or, you know, ethnomusicology that boils it down. So I just, the richness here and where it doesn't fit in, you are the one who can help us understand what's South African about it.
Thank you.
Not really a question, but
No, I agree with that fully, and I think I am not trying to answer what South African jazz is, because I will be undone at conferences if I even try to, but I'm trying to unpack parts of it, and especially style, from the perspective of practitioners, and which is not often done in our literature. But I think, like you're saying, the voices of women were silent, and that was based on the criteria for this particular study. And that also just speaks to the history of female instrumentalists within the South African jazz context, which is what we're trying to do in one of the book projects, speaking to female voices only.
John.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I've realized that you were pressed with time, so you actually want just to delve into your data analysis and presentation. I have been wondering, I know Elman, Herbs, some people have done something on popular music in South Africa.
Yeah.
Is there some work done in the area of jazz? And
Yes.
how is yours different? Or
Yes.
what are you adding to the
So
literature?
that is an important question. For the sake of time, I wanted to speak about the literature and the type of literature I looked at. And I did that. So I looked at, first of all, literature talking about musical styles. So what is musical style, and its understandings and what has been written about that. I also looked at the history of popular music in South Africa, like couplet as well, which you used, and the different sources that you're mentioning. Then I also looked at musical identity, the types of voice that this has been discussed, looking at it as discursive, as performative. I also looked at works that have looked at style within the South African jazz context, looking at what has been done there, but also the limitations of these. For example, where Davidson says, you can just tell that Barney Rachabane's style is simply African. What does that even mean? What does that mean? You know, you have, I think I really focused on someone like Salim Washington, who unpacked Chris McGregor's style, but more so Winston Mankunku's style. Then I also looked at the history of oral histories within jazz, so dating as far back as Alan Lomax's interviews with Jelly Roll Morton to Gwen Ansel's work on South African jazz musicians, Christopher Ballantyne's works, more recent work, interviews with Carl Shepard talking about his own works. So a lot of that was done because to position my work and also to show the need for my work, which is really unpacking what is involved in South African jazz pianism, which to my knowledge had not been done in literature to this extent. Yes, some have talked about I'm from the Transkei and therefore I incorporate these elements, but really speaking to the pianists about their conceptual processes, what involves their sounding of a style that they consider to be South African. So yeah, it involved a lot. Yeah. Teye?
So we have a Zoom question which Teye will voice on behalf of our Zoom participant.
Yeah, so the participant's name is Sindiswe Santi, and they just want to know briefly, what would you want to say that you didn't say? What would you want to share from, you know, would you love them to know that you didn't say?
That's a tough question because it's briefly say everything you didn't get to say.
Yeah, I think, I think that I just think we're allowed to speak. We are the generation that has a bit more freedom to speak and to try and undo the things which is never done or recognized. And I think I appreciate being on a platform like this because we get to hear what people are writing about. And I think just listening today, where we're in a room full of people talking about blackness in different ways, black ways of musicking, black ways of knowing, African ways of knowing, and that is a limiting description. But for me, and I think as someone who's new to the Academy, I appreciate the privilege we have of being able to do that, and also allowing our students to write about our music and bringing those practices into the classroom to do the stuff that wasn't done for me. So that's something I didn't say that I think I'd like to say, that we need to keep doing more of what we're doing. Yeah, to transform practically.
Thank you very much. So rumor has it that John-Doe and Phuti played at the Blue Llama Jazz Club in Ann Arbor, but didn't tell us about that. So we missed the performance. I think it's the first time we have 2 practicing musicians in the UMAPS cohort. We should do that more often. Thank you, Phuti, and thank you everybody else. So this brings us to the official end of today. There is still, I'm sure, cookies and coffee, which might not be as hot anymore. So please go and take more. Remember, next week we're back here. We're not in the league as we had previously thought we would be. And for the UMAPS scholars, because the weather is going to be nice on Saturday, the party is going ahead. I will send you information. Thank you.